And I want to tell you about something that was said by a military officer who worked for the Joint Staff in the Pentagon in the late 1990s. He told this to a fellow member of the national security elite in Washington, D.C., which was then passed on to a scholar at Tufts University a few years ago. The statement that was made, attributed to a member of the Joint Staff, that is the staff that serves the Joint Chiefs of Staff in Washington, D.C. and the Pentagon, is as follows. A few terrorist attacks against American citizens is a small price to pay for remaining a superpower, by which they meant that it was a small price to pay for continuing to station U.S. troops and even increasing the U.S. military presence in the Middle East. And of course, the next step in this process was the invasion and occupation of Iraq. Now, the Bush administration didn't really think through what the implications of that might be for terrorism in the Middle East, terrorism that would be directed against the United States. But clearly, they should have known after the 9/11 attacks that bin Laden was intending to continue to attack the United States however he could, and he would take advantage of any provocation by the United States that would give al-Qaeda that excuse to train more people, to recruit more people. So when the United States went into Iraq, the first thing that happened within months was evidence that jihadists were joining up with al-Qaeda and going to Iraq from all over the Middle East. The CIA reported this in their intelligence estimates. It was published in the newspapers that that was the case. There was no mystery about that. What did the Bush administration do? It said, this is exactly what we wanted. They called it the flypaper strategy. And they argued that we have the terrorists right where we want them. We want them to come to Iraq. And of course, that was simply a justification for continuing the policy that they wanted to pursue because it served the interests of the national security bloc within the United States. And so what we see in Iraq, what we saw over the years from 2004 really to very recently, is that al-Qaeda fed off the US military presence in Iraq and the exacerbation of the sectarian conflict between Sunnis and Shiites in that country. And of course, the al-Qaeda is a Sunni organization, Sunni Wahhabi organization, violently anti-Shiite, and the extent to which the United States was clearly supporting a government in Iraq, which was a Shiite government, again, it played into the hands of al-Qaeda. It stimulated a movement of terrorists or would-be terrorists into Iraq, where they got training, experience, later on left Iraq, went back to their home countries where they could be available for later work in plots against the United States or against Europe. So the effect of Iraq policy was, again, clearly to pursue the interests of the national security institutions of the United States and the individuals who led them at the expense of the interests, the security interests of the American people themselves. Now, the story goes on. After the US invasion of Afghanistan, bin Laden was there in Afghanistan. That's where he plotted the 9/11 attacks. But the Bush administration was really not interested in tracking down and capturing bin Laden. That was never the intention of the US use of military forces in Afghanistan. They wanted to overthrow the Taliban, but they had no plan, and I've documented this in my own writing. They had no plan for capturing bin Laden, and indeed no interest in doing so. And a few months after bin Laden had left Afghanistan, crossed the border into Pakistan, you heard George W. Bush himself issuing very soothing statements to the American people saying, well, we don't believe that bin Laden is really very important, so we're not really worried about him. And that reflected, again, the attitude of the national security elite and the national security institutions of this country, that they were really not that interested in terrorism, per se. What they were interested in was wars that could justify big military budgets and all of the perquisites that went with them, and the power that they accumulated in the process. So, again, I want to just underline this truth that is not talked about at all, not talked about in Washington, not talked about around the country except by some of the most critical voices in this country, which is that the war system, which I now call the permanent war system, is dedicated fundamentally to the interests of the war state itself and is against the interest and is the major threat to the interests of the American people. The second truth that I want to talk about is that these wars of choice, starting with Vietnam, including Iraq and all the rest of them, right down to Libya, these wars have been fought not for the reasons that we've been told, and I'm not telling you folks anything that you don't already know, but you may be under the impression that these wars were fought for oil, that it's blood for oil. That's the explanation for these wars, which so obviously were not in the interest of the American people. I've been pursuing this mystery as to why the American government, the US government, has fought these wars for many years, ever since the Vietnam War, in fact, when I first began to do research on the US war in Vietnam. But it was not until after 2000 when I began to work on a book which would, in fact, address why the United States went to war in Vietnam, that I discovered the truth about why the United States fought in Vietnam. And it's not what you thought. It's not what we all thought.